Hello, everyone, and welcome to our The Buzz on Native Bees presentation. I'm thrilled to introduce Coleman Little, who is a lecturer at the University of Central Arkansas and a PhD student in entomology at the University of Arkansas. We're so glad that everyone could join us. If you're a guest online, please type your questions into the chat box. I'll be monitoring off to the side and I will give them to Coleman at the end of the presentation. If you're joining us in person, please raise your hands at the end and we'll answer the questions as they come in.
Thank you very much, Leslie. Today I have a pretty big task of trying to cover native bees in about an hour. And you'll see they're very, very complex. So there's really a lot to cover here. And so I'm just going to start in with the basic, why should you even really care about these bees? It's pretty straightforward, and I think most people understand a lot of plants need some sort of animal-mediated pollination. Right? And studies have shown that about 78% of temperate zone, that's where we are at, angiosperms, so flowering plants, require some form of pollination mediated by animals for either reproduction in general or just to promote gene flow. This number, let me switch to this, that number can get as high as 98% in some tropical regions. The reason bees are so important, so that's just animal-mediated pollination. Right? So all animals, butterflies included, but bees really show an exceptional ability to pollinate. And there's a lot of reasons for this. They tend to be very hairy, and that tends to transfer pollen very well. But the studies have shown that more native bees and just bees in general show a higher seed set. Increased pollination efficiency, so that is just number of pollen grains making it from one flower to another, and they do tend to be the most abundant pollinator in most ecosystems. Now this does depend on your ecosystem. I'm sure a lot of people are aware of your islands that rely on, say, bats for pollination, and also real interestingly, alpine and Arctic areas tend to rely more on flies. They seem a little bit better at warming themselves up in those cold conditions and tend to be the dominant pollinator. But everywhere else, bees tend to be the most abundant and most important pollinator. Now, I often ask people, kind of leading into this, what do you think of when you think of a bee? And these are typically the three answers that I will get. They make honey. They're in a hive, and there is a queen bee. Now, the problem with this is all based off of this bee, Apis mellifera, or the honeybee. Okay. Now, Apis mellifera is a very strange bee, and it is really not, to our best understanding, to base what a bee is off of one of the most bizarre bees that there are. Okay, so honeybees are just strange, right? And they don't represent the majority of bees. So what other than honeybees do people think of when you think of a bee? The next answer always is bumblebees. Okay, bumblebees are native in North America, and they're very important pollinators, but for bees, they're extremely large, okay? And they have a queen and workers. They're eusocial. They don't really make honey, all right? Only 7 species make honey in the world, but they're still pretty unusual for a bee. Then sometimes I'll get a carpenter bee, okay, usually with a few cuss words, and at least now we are getting to a different sort of social behavior. These don't have a queen. They're kind of solitary, but they're considered semi-social, which I'll talk a little more about later. And then if I get any other bees listed, someone with even more cuss words than the carpenter bees will mention sweat bees. They're called sweat bees because when we sweat a lot, like today in Arkansas, we'll sweat a whole bunch. The sweat bees will come trying to get salts off of our sweat. They'll get trapped in all of the liquid, think that they're about to die, and just start stinging things. And so that's why they accidentally sting, and it doesn't hurt that much, but it's surprising. Now, sweat bees traditionally refer to a family of bees called Halictidae, okay? But that's not really how people use that term. Typically, when people say sweat bee, they're talking about a small metallic bee. And I've talked a lot about the weird aspects of honeybees, and the bumblebees and carpenter bees are very large bees. Most of your bees are going to be small and metallic. Okay, so this describes the majority of bees that you would be interacting with. And that description, small metallic, spans 3 of the 7 families of bee. As you can see here, halictids, this is Apidae that honeybees are in, and then Megachilidae. So it's really not a great term to describe bees, all right? So, move on. So when we take our average understanding of what bees are, honeybees, there's 7 species worldwide. Bumblebees, there's about 250 species worldwide. So we have about 260 species represented there of the 20,000 species of bee around the world. So if we look at this stacked bar chart, you can see the proportion of bees that we actually know and understand is a very tiny amount compared to bees as a whole. Right? And this is a problem, especially when these 260 species are very unusual compared to the rest of the group. So what do some of these other bees look like? All right, I'm just going to walk through a few of these different ones. This here is Megachile. It's also called a leafcutter bee. They have very large mandibles, which you can kind of see there. One of the real neat characteristics, though, is they carry their pollen on their abdomen. That's called their scopa. You can kind of see it here behind this wing, but the majority of these bees are going to be black, fairly robust, so they're kind of wide, and they're going to be covered in a bunch of typically white hairs. Not all of them, but most. You can also get, this is an osmia. You may have heard of these as mason bees. Okay, this one's Osmia pumilia, and you can really see that scopa on the belly. Okay, or on the underside of their abdomen. If you ever see a bee flying around and it's carrying its pollen there, it's in this family, all right, which is separate from honeybees, but you can see this bright metallic coloration. A lot of osmia are like this, but some of them are just black with white or yellowish hairs. All right. Another member of Megachilidae are these very wasp-like, this one's called an Anthidiellum. I mentioned earlier, bees tend to be very hairy. Well, this one isn't. Right? You can still see there are hairs, okay? But this is a parasitic bee. I'll explain that a little bit more in a little bit. But essentially, these bees aren't collecting their own pollen, and so they don't have those scopa structures. But they still have hairs, they still visit flowers, and they do constitute pollination, even though probably not as much as some of the other bees. Now getting into halictids. Right? These are your traditional sweat bees, and this is one of the prettiest ones that we have here. In Arkansas, this one's Ogoclipsis metallica. I use this photo all the time because of its very bright iridescent colors. If you ever see anything just striking bluish green, it's going to be a halictid. Even though those other ones are metallic, they're not as vibrant as these members in Halictidae. Right? This is another member of halictids, though. This is Halictus, right? And the genus, this one specifically is Halictus ligatus, and you can see it does not have any of those bright colors. Okay, so you really have this wide range of what these bees look like. Moving on, most of these halictids are small, right? Nomia is, or it has a few species within it that are quite large. You can kind of see by the label down here and the pin, these bees are about the size of a bumblebee. And actually, many bumblebees are smaller than this individual. This, again, is considered a sweat bee, right? Which no one I would ever talk to is going to call this a sweat bee. So it just helps to understand this wide diversity that we have. My favorite characteristic of this group, you kind of lose it a little bit after they die, but these bands on its abdomen have this pearlescent color to them, and they're very, very pretty in sunlight. And actually, even other species of Nomia that are smaller have even more iridescence in those bands. This is what I call a sweat bee. It's in the genus Lacioglossum. These are the ones that get caught in your sweat and will sting you and can be irritating, especially because some of these are eusocial. And so they can occur in very large numbers in small areas. And they're tiny. You can see here the scale bar, 1 millimeter. These are going to average at about 4 millimeters long. They're very small bees, and they're hard to notice unless they're stinging you. And that's typically where most people do notice them. This is an extremely important pollinator in the state, though. Right? Next, this is actually moving to a different family. This is called a Hylaeus. And again, you're not seeing the number of hairs that the other bees have on this. But this one's not parasitic. This one is actually, it just has a special adaptation. So most bees, they carry their pollen on those scopa. This entire genus of bees carry their pollen in what's called their crop. It's a modified portion of their digestive system, and that's how they move pollen around. It is Hawaii's only pollinator are about 50 species of Hylaeus. Right? So they're still pollinating. They are transferring pollen from one flower to another, but we don't really understand that mechanism and how it works. All right, next up, I call this one the lawn bee. It's kind of an unofficial common name. There's a lot of those in bees because we don't have very many common names. But I find these to be very common in lawns that aren't treated with a lot of herbicides or pesticides in general. They really like white clover, and they can occur in very high numbers in lawn-like settings. They also occur in natural conditions as well. They just really seem to thrive in those lawn conditions. But this species, this Calliopsis andreniformis, really highlights something that is very common in bees, and that is this is the exact same species. They're exhibiting something we call sexual dimorphism, where the male looks very different from the female. This makes figuring out what bees you have that much more difficult. And we've actually even discovered, as the years have gone on and genetic information has gotten better, that what we once thought were 2 species are actually just 1. But that's just to highlight a phenomenon that's pretty common in bees. Next, we have Andrena, and I would say this is the look of your normal bee. Most of your native bees are going to have this general appearance, dark in color, some reddish hues, yellowish, whitish hairs covering the body. The one thing about Andrena, if you ever see, this is called facial phobia. It is really dense matted hair, and it typically runs along the inside of their eyes. That is an indicator for this genus. Right? Other groups have those phobia, but they are not filled with that dense hair that you can just see on the inside of that eye. Next, I have another weird one. This one's parasitic. This is actually parasitic to Calliopsis andreniformis, the lawn bee that I showed you earlier. And this is another very tiny bee. This one is probably only about 3 millimeters long. You see red, black, and then white eyes. Just a very unusual bee. Just trying to give you some idea of some of the diversity that you will find in these. Now, getting to things that might look a little bit more familiar, you might look at this and say, well, that's a bumblebee, but in fact, it is not. Bumblebees have a queen, there's a hive, they're nesting in the ground. This is Anthophora. Specifically, this one's called Anthophora abrupta, and it does nest in the ground, but it's entirely solitary. Right? These do not have the queen structure, and they are very different bees, even though, to the untrained eye, might look exactly the same. We also have, these are your longhorn bees, if you have heard of them. This is a Melisodes, and they are noted for having gigantic scopa. Right? It's a group of a few different genera that really have these massive scopa, and the males have enormous antennae. Some of the males, their antenna can reach almost all the way back to the end of their body. Another member of that longhorn group is Spastra. Okay, this is an extremely large bee. It's one of the largest ones that we have in the state. This is Spastra obliqua. And again, you can see those massive scopa. So if you see a bee flying around, it seems to have really long antennae and or gigantic pollen sacs on its legs, chances are it might be one of these groups that's a longhorn bee. Then, after looking at all of those, you can look at a bombus. Okay, now these are your traditional bumblebees, and you can really see the characteristic trait on this. This is the Southern Plains bumblebee, and it has a, we call it a corbicula on the hind leg. It's this bare patch of hair, and that's actually where they will stuff pollen. But the other members of bees that look generally like this around this area will not have that bare patch. If it's not covered in pollen, that's a pretty good way to identify it. All right, now moving on to some of the unusual ones, very wasp-like. This is actually one of my favorite ones to really look at. It's called Triepiolis. There's a few in this group, and one of the trademarks that it has are these bands, right, that aren't actually the exoskeleton that's colored white. These are matted hairs. Okay, so it's just real dense carpet of hair, and the black that is in between is actually also hair. This is a very interesting parasitic group that is very frequently observed on flowers. Okay, so we're really unsure at the level and quality of pollination that these provide, but we know that they're on a bunch of flowers, so they're bound to be providing some. Now looking at Nomata, this is a group that is very parasitic. We don't know of any that aren't. And pretty large, we don't understand them that well, but every combination of red, yellow, and black you will find on these bees. Very wasp-like. It actually wasn't until it was about 30 years ago that we figured out these were not wasps and they were actually bees. Right? So that's one of the newer movements into the group of bees. And then to end, this tiny little Ceratina. Okay, these are carpenter bees, technically. I'll talk a little bit more about how they nest in a little bit, but they're just extremely small, and you can see when you zoom in how different they are from, say, the sweat bees. Right? But superficially, if you're not looking close, they can look very, very similar. So with all of that, what is a bee? Right? I mean, they're kind of all over the place, and your initial response to what a bee is not very descriptive of the group. So just to give you more of a taxonomic overview, it's a group in the order Hymenoptera. This includes ants, wasps, velvet ants, and sawflies, which are very, very interesting and different. And honestly, it has to do with these plates on the exoskeleton called the pronotum. It's basically its back neck collar. And the pronotal lobe, which is this portion right here. I never look at those to identify whether it's a bee or not. Okay? Eventually, you just kind of can see the general shape and behavior of what a bee is, but technically, that is what you would be looking for. That lobe is one of the more distinctive parts. You're going to have scopa present on most. I've already shown you some that don't have scopa, but it's certainly the norm to have some sort of pollen-carrying hair structures located either on the legs or the underside of the abdomen. Many other bees also carry pollen on their thorax in these back portions over here. If any of you have ever seen me speak before, you will know I say most more than any other word. That is just something you have to get in the habit of when talking about bees, because they all have exceptions. So most females are going to have modified ovipositors that we call stingers. Okay, so that's what's sticking out right here. That's what we often know bees and wasps for having. But it's important to note here that these are ovipositors. That is how an insect lays eggs. Males don't lay eggs, and so males don't have stingers. Okay, so it's only the females that can sting you. And again, it's most. There are multiple genera in South America that don't have any stinger whatsoever. They're called stingless bees, but those aren't here, so I won't talk too much about them. So for bees, they're in Hymenoptera anthophylum. Okay, and they're very diverse. There are 7 families all over the world. For more information on those, the Arkansas Monarch Conservation Partnership is posting a family each day of Pollinator Week, so check that out for more information on those. And within those 7 families, you're going to have 443 genera and 20,000 described species. Actually, over 20,000, the list just keeps growing. That is a massive number of species for just a small group of insects. All right, and then most are very strict vegetarians. Okay? And what that means is their only source of nitrogen, that's how you make proteins. Right? So pretty important. Their only source for proteins comes from pollen. With the exception of 3 species in Panama, they're all going to be eating pollen as a source for protein. Okay, so why should you care about these other ones? I mean, we have honeybees. Honeybees do a very good job of pollination. And in general, if you look at the studies, when we are looking at how does pollination compare with a honeybee and then groups of native bees, there are several studies that show increased yields and especially increased profits when they enhance the pollinator communities in the surrounding areas. Okay? Some studies don't actually show this though. None of them show like a decrease, right, by enhancing native bees, but some just show no difference. But the problem here is that's not really saying that the native bees aren't really helping. That is more an indication of how complicated these pollination systems really are. So to start in with the complexity, I'm just going to start really broad. Just think of different flower structures. All right, here we have a lily and a sunflower, and it's very obvious to see they're keeping their anthers and their stigma in different ways. All right, and just the entire structure is different. Different pollinators are going to be more or less effective with those different structures. And when you really look at different flowers, like up at the top, this is an orchid, we have rattlesnake master, and this is a passion flower. Very, very different structures. Right? And those are going to need to be pollinated in a different way to be more or less effective. The bottom, we have a legume. This is a tomato and a blueberry. Again, very different structures, and these are crop plants. Okay, so it's really important that we understand how these different flowers are impacted by different pollinators. One of the more recent discoveries you may have heard of is buzz pollination, which these flowers would require. Bumblebees emit a frequency, and it's only that frequency that will release pollen for them to gather. So that's different flowers and how different flowers are structured. Now we have to consider how different pollinators are structured. Flies are very important pollinators. Okay, even areas like here where bees are definitely the most important, flies are a very close second. Beetles are very important, and then butterflies. And just think of how those insects would be interacting with a flower, how pollen might stick to them, and how they might transfer to another flower, and how that flower is structured will affect that as well. Bats are a whole nother thing. They're more similar to birds, so bats and birds are often lumped together. But even when you look at bees, okay, you can just think of a bee sticking their face in a flower, and if that's the structure of that flower, you can see the serotina isn't going to collect nearly as much pollen as this really hairy face of this leafcutter bee. Right? So there's a lot of differences in the pollinators and the flowers that are being pollinated. Okay, so to visualize that a little bit better, okay, look at how these different bees are carrying their pollen in different ways. This is going to be a longhorn bee, and you can see very loose pollen rough on the scopa. This is a bumblebee that is using that corbicula and really packs that pollen in tightly there. There's less loose to pollinate the flowers. And you can just kind of see how this is also a longhorn bee. Just interacting with a different flower shape and structure might interact with that pollen differently. And then, I mean, megachilies are one of my favorites. And you can really see how carrying that pollen on the underside of your abdomen is really good with interacting, especially with these compound flowers, right? But also just holding it there is just really, really good way to transfer pollen. I will note, as we were talking about this, the amount of moisture that bees mix with pollen is also going to affect how much pollen actually transfers and pollinates a flower. They will mix saliva and nectar with the pollen, so it's more easily transferable. And you can see that one is packed in a lot more. It's mixed with a lot more nectar than this one. Right? So just in general. Now, looking at this bottom photo, the one I haven't talked about yet, this is a hibiscus being visited by a honeybee. All right? Now, it's kind of important to note, most of the time, I mean, it's not on a bee or any pollinator's mind to transfer pollen. Right? Those things do happen, and you can see very intensive sort of pollination, but most of the time they're gathering resources, they're getting nectar. That's exactly what this honeybee is doing. Right? And you can see, I mean, all of the pollen and the female parts are out here. There's no pollination occurring whatsoever. Now, this is an extreme example, okay? But you can kind of envision the full spectrum of these different pollinator visits by understanding some of these bees aren't interacting the same way with these different flowers. So, just in general, having a very diverse pollinator community means that you have a wide diversity in how your plants are being pollinated. Okay, now this can be very important in an agricultural setting. What we have here in this picture are canola flowers. Right? On the left, very healthy, very large, big canola flowers. And then on the right, very small. Same species, it's just not producing as large of flowers. So studies have shown native bees will prefer lower flower density and smaller flowers when they are actively competing with honeybees. Right? And then, if you look at honeybees, they have been shown to really prefer very large floral displays. So, in an agricultural setting or even in a garden setting, if you combine the two, you get really good coverage. And I am going to visualize it with this. Okay, imagine this is your crop. Okay, and you just have it's never going to be completely uniform. You're going to have some plants producing more or less flowers. This computer is moving slow. Here in the bottom right corner, I don't know what's going on there. I mean, obviously I just made this up, but let's just say you have salt building up in that area, or something wrong with your irrigation. It's not getting as much water. For whatever reason, that bottom right corner is not growing as well. So the idea here is, if you just have honeybees, they're going to go to the very large flowers, right? The very large floral displays, and they're just going to skip over the small ones because it's not really worth their time. If you augment that with native bees, they are going to go in there and provide pollination to flowers that otherwise wouldn't get any. And so having as many different pollinators in an area is essentially insurance. And it helps to give you full coverage of whatever crop you're looking at least in terms of pollination. So how would you enhance these pollinator communities? Like, what can you do to get more diversity of these in your area? You really have to understand a few aspects of what your typical bee does. And that is nesting behavior. That's really big. So social behavior can be big in that. But really your foraging range. Where are they nesting and how far are they going away from their nest? All right? And then also, which flowering species do you have present in an area? It's always a good idea to have more diversity, okay? But you also want diversity in your time of year. We call that the phenology of these flowers. So the way all of that works, or I guess really what you are looking at is, let's just start with social behavior. All right? This first example here are, these are eusocial bees. You have a queen, a male, and workers. It's typically what we think of. It's what honeybees do. It's what bumblebees do, and that's what is pictured here. All right, so those are your eusocial insects, as we call them. But then next, we have semisocial, which I mentioned earlier. Those carpenter bees do this. Now, these are very interesting, and I would say this is probably the more rare instance in bees. And these will kind of live in a community. And specifically with the eastern carpenter bee, they will gather resources for each other's nests, protect each other's nests. Some of them will even nest in the exact same cavities. They all work together for everyone else, but they are solitary. Each female is laying eggs and reproducing just like a queen would in a hive setting. Then you have parasitic. I've mentioned this a few times, and it's kind of strange to say bees are strict herbivores and then they're parasitic. Okay, but these are what we call kleptoparasites, right, in which they steal resources. And the way these bees work, and I saw something recently that we think somewhere around a quarter of all bee species are parasitic. So it's a pretty common behavior. Okay, but they're basically flying around. They'll have a host species or a set of species. They'll lay their eggs in their nests. Their eggs hatch first, eat all of the pollen that the other species gathered. Sometimes they will directly kill the larva, but then they pupate and emerge. So they aren't actually gathering the resources, but they're still eating nothing but pollen, just pollen someone else collected. And like I said, they're still visiting flowers. Their effectiveness as pollinators is really unknown, but we know they're doing something. And then you have the most common. About 70% of all bee species are considered solitary. And there's a pretty wide range of solitary behavior. You can just be solitary, completely on your own, but then you can also nest in what is called aggregations. And that's where you're solitary, you have your own nest, but everyone seems kind of clumped together. And it's a little uncertain whether your nesting resources just tend to be clumped together, or if they actually prefer to nest with each other. It's probably some combination of the two. And then communal is very interesting, and there's a really good analogy for what communal is. It's very much like a bunch of people living in an apartment building. Okay, so as far as bees go, they're all using the same entrance, but they have their own divisions after that they are maintaining themselves. So the apartment building complex, everyone's using the same entrance, elevator, hallways, but they have their own room that they are taking care of. And bees do the exact same thing, just in the ground typically, sharing the same entrance, but taking care of their own young. Now, their social behavior gets coupled in with their nesting behavior. And we're kind of in a transition of terms here. All right, so we have tunnel nesting, which traditionally would have been small cavity nesting. Right? Your large cavity nesting is now just cavity. Right? Soil nesting is by far the most common. Again, you've got about 70% of bee species will nest directly into the soil. And then you have dead wood and pith, right, in which they're going to be boring into those substrates, making their nests. Some people will lump the dead wood and pith nesting in with tunnel nesters. All right? So there is some movement going on with that, but in general, I like this format. I think it's more descriptive. So starting with the most common, soil nesting bees. Now this figure that I'm showing here is a soil composition triangle, and we have percent clay on this side going from 0 to 100, silt 0 to 100 in this direction, and then sand 0 to 100 in this direction. Now, each symbol is indicative of a different family of bee that they were looking at. These families are a little out of date, but it still is showing different bees. Now, the first impression that I always get from this is, well, bees like sand, and in general, they absolutely do, but they don't like just sand. All right? They want it mixed with a few other things. Clay can be pretty common, but silt tends to be fairly preferred as well. But they also want a different mixture of those three components, depending on which bee species we're talking about. Right? So they really like a diversity in the composition of the soil. And then what are they doing once they're nesting in the soil? A lot, and we don't actually know most of it. These are Andrena nests. Andrena likes to nest in the soil, and these are actually showing communal nests. They sometimes can make these real long tunnels, and then these black portions are showing what an individual would be taking care of. So all of the bees might be using the white portions, and then it is the black portions that an individual is maintaining. But it's so different depending on what species you're looking at. And the ones that we found, they all seem to be nesting a little bit differently. Okay, so we have no idea what the majority of these soil nesters are doing, but every time we look, they seem to be doing something a little different. There's a lot of attention on bee houses, and I'm going to talk about the ones for tunnel nesters in a moment, but this was recently posted by Sam Droege in his experiments with soil nesting habitat. And he essentially is trying different compositions of soil in different containers. Old flower pots. This is an old styrofoam ice chest that didn't have any other use for, stuffed it full of soil, and he is having some success with bees nesting inside of them. Now, some bees nest really deep in the soil. And this probably wouldn't be all that viable for them, but it's certainly something that is intriguing and people are trying out. Now your dead wood borers. Okay, what we're looking at in these diagrams here, these are galleries of Xylocopa virginica, the eastern carpenter bee, and this is the one that everyone cusses because they're boring into their deck or their porch, and what they're doing is they're making these galleries. I get asked a lot, is there a pesticide that could be used? Not really. They're not eating that wood. They're simply excavating it. All right? So you couldn't treat the wood or anything like that. They're just spitting it out anyways. But this is what they are doing. They make these partitions in the wood, and that is where they're laying their eggs. Like I said, they can actually share the exact same, these are galleries, as another individual. Now, we have two species in Arkansas. Right? This is the one everyone's familiar with. Xylocopa micans is solid black, the male not as much, but the female is, and still a pretty large bee. These are not known to bore into lumber. Okay, so they're going to find a dead limb and bore into that. Okay, but these don't tend to be pests, and it's probably why we don't notice them as much, but still a very important, very large bee for the state. It tends to occur basically central Arkansas and south. And then you have your pith borers. Okay, these are carpenter bees, actually just the same as those last ones that we talked about, but these are teeny tiny. And they're going to find the dead herbaceous stems that were left behind, usually by flowers from the year before, and they are going to bore into the center of those, the pith, and that's where they are going to make their nest provisions. We really only have a handful of species of these Ceratina, as they are called. They're the only ones that do pith nesting here. But wherever they occur, they tend to occur in very large numbers and seem to be extremely important pollinators for that area that you find them. Okay, so now we have tunnel nesters. Okay, now these will nest anywhere. that the dimensions work. I actually pulled a leaf cutter nest from in between my brick wall and rain gutter one time. And that was just because it fit there. So they will use any crevice that they can take advantage of. Most of the time, it's going to be cracks in dead wood, maybe exit holes of some wood-boring beetle, or even in something like a pile of rocks. If they just happen to make the right size crevice, they would even take advantage of that. And what they're doing in those tunnels is, well, the leafcutter bees are lining it with leaves and laying their eggs in there with pollen. This middle row is depicting resin bees, okay? And so they will actually line it with secretions that are waterproof. Okay, so these bees tend to do really good in more wet conditions, but you can see even the larva of a bee there. Not everyone gets to see a bee larva because they're all hidden. Then on the bottom, we have mason bees. Right? They use mud, but we're also seeing some observations now that they really like to mix this mud with chewed up bits of plant, right? Presumably to reinforce that mud, but they surround their larvae and pollen that they gather. You can still see some of the pollen right here in this cell for the larva to grow and develop there. These tunnel nesting bees are the target of these bee houses that I'm sure you have seen. Right now, I want to caution everyone about these bee houses. I pulled these images from, well, this one's from Amazon. I just did bee house, and the first image it gives me is this one that's surrounded by a bunch of honeybees. Honeybees would not like this at all. All right, that is not what's being targeted here. That should be your first red flag. Same sort of issue here with this honeybee. Now, some of these are really good. Okay, they are not bad. Some of them look very pretty when you piece them together. I'm not saying all of these are not good. I'm just saying if they're advertising it with a honeybee, be cautious. Right? The good ones are going to be using relatively native materials, untreated wood. All of this varnish on the outside of this is not going to be good for bees. That will leach into these eventually. And so just be cautious. My favorite thing to tell people, though, is just get on-site materials and make your own. All right? Surely there's some wood or something. River cane seems to work very, very good to kind of make those tubes. But just start drilling holes in it. I typically say somewhere about 3/8 of an inch, and then select 10 sizes down. You really are going to have trouble getting too small. There's some very tiny bees out there. And just do all different size holes. All right, go about as deep as you comfortably can without going through the other side, and then try to prop it up somewhere. It doesn't have to be so prominent as this one. I'd probably keep it out of the sun and out of wet areas, even if you're targeting those resin bees. If you do this, you also need to be open to spiders and wasps moving in as well. All right, so maybe don't necessarily put it right next to your door if you're uncomfortable with those things. Okay, but we're in Arkansas. They're going to move in too, but the longer you let it mature in those areas, the more bees that you are going to get. And then we have our cavity nesters. Okay, these were previously called large cavity nesters, and that's because they need a large cavity. Right? These are eusocial bees. They need an area for their hive to grow and expand. And I'm sure that we're at least mildly aware of honeybees needing that. But bumblebees need them as well. This is a bumblebee nest. Obviously, it's not my photo, but it's hard to get a photo of them. They like to find a vacated rodent nest. All right, so they typically nest in the soil, but they're not excavating out of the soil. They're finding a previously used cavity, and that is where they will be nesting. Your average bumblebee nest is going to range between 20 to 50 workers. Right? They're not nearly the same size as the thousands that you would get with honeybees. So once you have a grasp on all the different places that they can nest in, right, how far are they leaving those nests? Well, it's been correlated with this thing called interticular span, right, which is really just a unit of size. The larger the bee, the farther it will tend to forage. All right. Now, the tigula, which that's based off of, is what's shown here. That's the base of the wings, or technically the pad above that, and it's how far apart they are. So it's just a measurement of size, but it's really not that simple. Bees are only going to move as far as they need to. Right? And so if they have plenty of resources, they're not going to fly as far as a bee that has to travel to get the same amount of pollen. Okay, but I've been talking about the complexity of bees a lot. When you consider this largest bee in North America and smallest bee in North America, you can see where this really starts to get complex. There's every bee size in between these two. Right? And so they're all going to be capable of traveling different distances. So to visualize that, this is not at all to scale. But if you were, say, maintaining this area, right, and you really wanted to enhance your pollinators, okay, you enhance a bunch of the nesting resources inside of the area that you're managing. Right? And if they're a small bee, you might only get these tiny little ranges. Right? And everything you do in your habitat directly affects their entire world. But you also have larger ones, right, that might still only be affected by everything you do in your management area, right? But you're going to have a lot of overlap. Right? And they're just going to, in general, I mean, these would never be perfect circles either, but they are going to be sticking next to their nest. But now, I mean, that's just small bees. Larger bees are going to be influenced by areas immediately around your management area. And so you have to consider that as well, but then you can go even farther. Right? It might start getting very far outside of what you're actively managing is giving you the different bee species that are visiting the flowers in your management area. And then, I mean, with things like carpenter bees and the really large ones, they might be coming from very far away. You might have no idea where they're nesting because they're capable of flying so far away. So you really have to consider, well, I mean, if you're looking at a small bee, its home is probably really close by, right? But anything honeybee size and larger really have a long range that they are capable of flying. Whether they do or not is really dictated by how much and how many flowers are located in an area. So, what impacts bee communities in an area? Flower species diversity. Right? Just real straightforward and direct there. The more diverse and complex your flower assemblage is, the more diverse and complex your bee and just in general your pollinator community is going to be. Right? So, show this graph all the time, and everyone's first impression of it is, well, that is entirely too complex. I can't read anything. You don't need to. Okay, that's not the point here. This is called a pollinator web. One of my favorite things to look at. There's a lot going on here, but it's easier to understand once you understand the layout. We have 2 years represented, 2004, 2005. For each year, all right, the plants are on the left side and the bees are on the right side. Each line that is connecting a bee and a plant is indicating a recorded interaction between that bee and that flower of that plant species. The species listed at the bottom, or for these plants, they were visited by a lower number of different pollinators. The plants at the top were visited by a greater number of different pollinators. And then the same thing for the bees. These bees at the bottom went to, well, at this bottom, they only went to one single flower species. And at the top, they're going to a diversity of different flowers. Now, to remove that so we can look at this a little bit more, there's a lot that we can really see that's happening here and understanding how these bee communities work. One, look at all of these specialists. Right? All of these bees are only going to a single flower species. But what is that flower species? if you follow these lines, there are these plants that have several different pollinators. And that's not to detract from how important they are. Because they're only going to one species, they tend to have a pretty high pollinator efficiency, okay, because they're only going to that one. But if we look at these generalists that are at the top, they are the only pollinator for these plants located at the bottom. Right? So our typical understanding is, yeah, you're specialists. Those are really important. We have to conserve them. And I'm not saying don't. It's very important to conserve as much as we can. But if we lost this species of bee down here, that plant still has pollination service. If we lose this top generalist, all of these plants lost their only pollinator. Okay, so they're all really important for the different services they provide. Right? And the whole complex is really important to try to understand. And then there are, if you noticed, these. There are a couple that are tied to one another. This bee goes to that plant and nothing else does. And so if you lost that plant, you're going to lose that pollinator. Okay, and so those interactions happen as well. Right? And an ecosystem, those are certainly less common, right? But they still do happen. And then this is the same site the next year. You can even see how that changes. Okay? It's not the same level of interactions that occur the very next year. All right? So these are very complicated. We're really just trying to tease out what it all means, but we can certainly get a few take-home messages from that more superficially. The other thing to really look at when you're thinking of flowers in an area is phenology. What we're looking at here is a number of bee species throughout a year in Florida. Okay, this is in Florida, so they've got active insects all year long. And this is the total number, right? All the other lines are different families of bees. But you can see, obviously, I mean, there's a spike here in March and April. There's always some bees present, but it fluctuates throughout the year. Right? Those are going to be different species. Some bee species are only flying around for about 2 weeks out of the year. Others a month, some 2 months, and then things like honeybees and a few other species can fly anytime it's warm enough. Okay, so there's this wide range of different activities at different times of year. And so time of year is very important when considering your flowers. When are they flowering? Okay, but then there's also this time of day aspect. Different flowers are going to make nectar and pollen at different times of the day. And some of these bees are active in the morning or the afternoon. Some bees, specifically some desert species, are only active at night. And so understanding how these flowers work is very important to enhancing these communities. We don't know a lot of this information, but in general, we can easily say and how to enhance these bee communities, increase flower diversity. Right? That's not going to hurt anything, and it will only help bolster that complexity that we see in these pollinator interactions. And so when I say diversity, I do mean different species, but also different species that are flowering at different times of the year. Okay, but then also different genera of flowers. Okay, bees, when they specialize, it tends to be in a genus of flowers because the flower structure is very similar. And so just having a wide range of different flower structures present in a community is only going to help your pollinator communities. And then you want to increase the diversity and availability of nesting resources. Okay, so this is soil cavities, leaving herbaceous stems for those serratinas. I get asked a lot, when should I mow? For instance, and my answer is as infrequent as you possibly can. Wait as long as you can, and that's going to be better. Now, I know that never mowing is not really an option for a lot of people, but the more you can hold back, the better. And then soil diversity. Cavities, actually, through research, there's not a huge deficit in cavities. specifically in suburban areas, but soil. And this even attaches to this availability. You might have a lot of soil in your lawn, but it's not available. Right? The way lawn grasses grow, they crowd next to each other a lot, and that soil isn't really accessible for these soil nesting bees. Native plants tend to leave gaps in between each other, and that's perfect for a lot of these native bees. And so just having available soil is really important for bolstering your bee diversity. All right, and that's what I have. With that, I will take any questions y'all might have.
Okay, I've got a bunch of questions.
Okay.
But it all kind of relates to the mechanisms of feeding and nest management. Okay, so when you show those pictures, some of them have pretty mean looking mouth parts.
Yes.
So is that only for crunching on pollen and gathering pollen? And do they depend on the pollen sticking to the pollen carrying parts, or do they transfer it from their mouth to that section of their body with those mouth parts?
So you're more talking like these mouth parts?
Mm-hmm.
These specifically.
Really fast. Will you try and summarize that question into the microphone?
Oh, sorry about that. So the question is, I mean, some of these bees have these real impressive, and this actually isn't even the most impressive mouth parts you can find on bees. What exactly are they doing with that in terms of pollen collection and, well, gathering it and then moving it around? There's a couple aspects to that. I'm going to start in with the mandibles. These, you can get a few different mandibles with bees. Males often have gigantic mandibles that they use because they don't have a nest. And so when they're sleeping or it's windy, they need large mandibles to grab onto a plant. And they'll just hold on in the wind so they don't get blown around all over the place. Then some are boring into wood, and they'll have specialized mandibles for that. These, I love Megachile. These are your leaf cutter bees. They're using these to cut sections of leaves out. And I typically show some, I guess I don't have one handy, but they will cut nearly perfect little circular sections out of leaves. I know that they love red buds for this, but you'll just see little circles cut out of redbud leaves, and they are doing that to, I'm just gonna, I don't know if I can, that tunnel nesting image with all those leaves packed in, that's what they're doing with it. And I've even seen them gathering flower petals in the same way. They'll cut that in it. And I've seen flagging tape with those cuts taken out of them. And so they, I don't know what it is about the petals. Some people seem to think that it is soft for their young. I don't know, but they are using those mandibles to make those cuts. Now, with pollen collection, it's very different depending on the bee you're working with. As I mentioned, some bees will mix more or less saliva with the pollen. And so for like this one, they are going to be gathering nectar and pollen and kind of mixing them together and packing them in those corbicula. The pollen doesn't necessarily go in their mouth, but there is a lot going on there with the mouth parts. And then Hylaeus, that genus that's not very hairy, is the only native pollinator in Hawaii, they actually store their pollen internally in their crop, much like a bird. And so it'll come back to their nest and regurgitate it. They pollinate. We're not really sure how, but they have to be regurgitating or doing something to allow that pollen transfer, and we're just really not sure about it.
Okay, so how, with them not having hives, when we think about honeybees, we think about a lot of management and interaction between the adults and the eggs and the larvas and all that. So how much interaction, if you're a solitary bee and you're depositing in the pith of a flower stem, are you having any interaction, or do you pack that with pollen and go away and never come back? And how many times do you visit to pack that stem with pollen?
So it would probably be worth flipping through to that tunnel nesting slide. So basically,
Could you try and summarize?
oh yes. No, thank you for pointing that out. I was talking with Leslie earlier. I'm horrible about repeating questions. So the question is the amount of parental care, basically. Is it comparable to honeybees? Are they making multiple visits back to their nest? And what is the extent of the interaction with probably the larva, I'm guessing? There's almost no interaction with the larva that we can tell. What they do is that's kind of hard because there's not really a beginning on here, but let's just say this is the back of this tunnel that it's nesting in. They will gather pollen, mix it with the nectar, and they make what you call a pollen loaf. And it's just kind of this, it's got a few names.
Like bee bread.
Bee bread is one that I hear that's kind of cute. And so they'll make the appropriate sized lump of pollen. That's what we see right here because that egg didn't hatch or something happened in that cell. And they'll lay an egg and then cap that cell. And then they go on and try to gather more for the next cell. And so they actually have to be pretty strategic, and they have, it's not well understood, but they have mechanisms to make sure that this bee emerges last, right? Because if they're leaving out this way, if this one emerges first, it has to go through all the rest of them.
But it's actually the one that was the egg is the oldest and was deposited first.
That takes the longest to
But
emerge.
somehow,
And sometimes there are errors. It's not always perfect. Sometimes there are errors and all the rest of those bees die because this one emerged first. Or sometimes they're just damaged. But they have a mechanism where the ones closest to the entrance will emerge first. Sometimes it's male-female, but there will be multiple males kind of like jammed near the entrance, and it's sequential. That one closest to the entrance will emerge first, and so on. And so no interaction with their living offspring, basically just provide everything they will need to make it to an adult, seal them off from the outside world, some of them waterproof them, and then they don't actually interact with them.
okay. Well, are there multiple generations within a spring to winter, or does that particular species, they all nest at the same time, the adults go off and die, and it's not till the next year that the larvae and the new bees emerge?
Right, so the question is, got it, are there multiple generations of a species within a year? In general, the norm is one. I'm unaware of there being multiple generations within a year. It wouldn't surprise me because bees have exceptions for everything. But if they're active for a longer period of time, they are going to just make more of these cells.
Okay.
And then those will emerge the following year. So it is pretty much one generation each year.
Okay, so last question. What's the percentage when they're active on a flower, when they visit a flower? Do we know how much they're eating versus how much pollen they're eating that individual is taking into its body for nourishment versus how much it's storing to take back to the nest?
So with honeybees, worker honeybees don't consume any pollen. Adults of some of these native species have been documented consuming some pollen, but they don't eat very much. So just in the way insects grow and live and survive, once you make it to an adult, you don't really need to make very many more proteins.
Okay.
So if you're having a particularly good year and you're laying a whole bunch of eggs, you might need a little more protein to make a few more eggs. And in those cases, we see a little bit more pollen consumption. But the adults, pretty much, they eat nectar.
Okay.
And then the larvae are what are consuming pollen.
So since they don't have a proboscis like a butterfly, how do they get to nectar?
They have, how do they get to nectar? Did I repeat the last one? I did
It's
not.
okay. It was kind of in the question.
Okay. Well, I
I
guess
mean,
I
they
addressed it well enough. It was that one picture with the mouth parts on the one. There we go. Some of them have very long tongues. And a traditional classification for bees is long-tongued bees and short-tongued bees. That's kind of indicative of the types of flowers they like to go to. Can they reach the nectar? But some other bees, let's tie this into the mouth parts you were mentioning, they'll actually, especially like your trumpet-shaped flowers, they'll just go to the back end and cut the back end and just, it's called nectar robbing, and they'll just get nectar that way. But most of them can access nectar from most flowers. Otherwise, they're just not going to visit that one. They're going to go to one that they can access.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Two-part question. Do pithy stem nesters lay eggs in this year's or last year's stems?
Okay, so
Repeat it.
okay. Do pith nesters nest in this year's or last year's stems? I know that there's a lot of goldenrod and things like liatris stems that are used in this area, and seratinas aren't necessarily that active by the time those are turning dead. So I would have to say it would be the previous years. But I'm actually not sure if anyone has directly investigated that, but it makes sense that it would be last year's. But I've seen a lot of reports of other types of stems they're going into, like blackberry, and so they might, it's probably just if it's available at the time they are doing it, that they'll use that. So.
Second part to that question, is it less important to leave pithy stems in the garden here than further north?
Is it less important to leave pithy stems in the garden here or further north? I am really unsure of that. A lot of times when you really look at bees, you get really confined to a small region because of how complex they are. And so I know Arkansas pretty well. I'm unfamiliar with going more up north, but I know they have Ceratina. And so it's got to be equally as important. And it typically just ties into mowing. And just no matter what, every study I've ever seen, the less frequently you mow, the better your bees look.
Or cleaning up their garden.
Yeah, or cleaning up your garden, leaving any of those old flower stems, and maybe even just kind of breaking part of the top off and making that a little more accessible is probably, I mean, unless it just drives you crazy, it would be better to leave those behind for bees. I've also heard people bringing up the idea of gathering them and bunching them together and maybe even like tying them together and leaving those somewhere. Unsure how that might work, but it seems like a good idea to me, so it's worth a shot, I would say.
One more question. What time of year do mason bees nest?
What time of year do mason bees nest? Typically, it's going to be this all depends on where you're at. I would say the norm is March to June, maybe through June, but there's some species that are active longer throughout the year, and as long as you're seeing adults active, they are gathering resources for their nest, and so that they would be nesting during that time. You see a sharp fall off of osmia this time of year in August, or in Arkansas. Megachile, the leafcutter bees, seem to be very common here, more so than where I see a bunch of research coming out of.
With that, how area specific is that? Like how quickly
would that not hold true moving northward?
The osmia component, or when they're nesting.
Nesting time periods in general.
So, how would nesting time periods change as you move north, essentially? That's a decent question. The species change so much as you go that it's hard to nail that down. But in general, the more active your growing season, the warmer it is, the longer they will be active.
So like is
But-
accurate for Arkansas, likely accurate for like neighboring states,
So
but less accurate moving farther away kind of thing?
most of the phenology bee information that I see comes from the Northeast. And when I say, oh, this species is active from this month to this month, I basically just tag on a month to either side of that here in Arkansas. But that's also just to kind of make sure I'm covering the ground. From what I've seen, it typically doesn't vary more than a few weeks from, say, here to Maryland.
So is it too late to put a mason bee nest out for their use?
Is it too late to put out a mason bee nest for their use? I mean, they're not going to be using, mason bees wouldn't be using them this year. I wouldn't say it's too late because getting it established is good. And you might get some of the leafcutter bees moving in. They will be active really through October even. I still see some megachilies and they would use those the same. It's too late for mason bees to use it this year, but I would say go ahead and put one out.
Coleman, how important are native plants to our native bees?
So how important are native plants to our native bees? That's broad. There's a lot there. It depends on which bee we're talking about. So if you want to talk about like native blueberries, we have blueberry specialists. We have a Haberpoda species here that only will go to those blueberries. We don't support our native blueberries. It's going to suffer horribly. Then you have like, say, your lawn bee, which loves native plants. That Caliopsis andreniformis loves native plants, but also does just fine with the non-natives. And so it's a case-by-case situation and which one is going to be affected or not. So typically when I think of enhancing native plants, what's going through my head is having a bunch of different species, really increasing that diversity, and that as a whole is definitely better for bees as a whole.
I've got a question about that graph you showed where all those lines going back and forth and the bees going to.
Pollination web.
Yes, so talk about the mechanisms of gathering that information. So does a researcher go and camp next to that flower, one of those species of flowers, for a certain period of time and make notes on which bees show up and how often they show up and then go and camp out at another flower? And
So basically, how was this data gathered? And this one specifically, exactly what you said. They essentially had different areas that they would position themselves and they would repeatedly visit, and you set up an observation period. It'd be 5 minutes, it'd be 30 minutes. I don't remember exactly what it was in this study, but they are recording, and this is actually a bit of a problem with some of this data. They're recording a visit to a flower where there seemed to be some interaction. So just landing on the flower wasn't good enough, but they potentially could have just gotten nectar and they would have recorded it. And it's really hard to figure out when, a pollination event occurs versus just gathering nectar. And we don't really have a good answer as to getting that. Sometimes you will see these are generated by, you can collect a bunch of bees with pollen on them and analyze the pollen you gather. Now that actually even adds extra complexity to this whole thing, because even though this species might be observed going to all of these different plants, an individual of that species might only be visiting one species. That one individual might show a preference, and it is only going to this one species of flower. This other individual likes these 5, that one will go to 50 different flowers. And so even within the species, there's a wide range of specialization, and it makes it that much more difficult to talk about. But these are like some of the complexities that we don't really know and understand, that we need to try to figure out. And we are working to gather that information. Yes.
Going back to nesting seasons, in terms of, or I guess, is there any evidence of or research investigating like the raising or rising average temperatures on those nesting seasons? Like, are they active for longer periods of time? Does the summer, like summers get hotter, or are those nesting seasons pretty much the windows that they have been forever, I guess?
So basically, so your question was, with rising temperatures, are there foraging periods expanding? Are they getting longer? I thought you were going to go a different direction when you started asking that question, so I'll hop back to that. As far as duration of foraging season, I would say I don't really know if there's that much information on that, because it also just kind of seems to be all over the place in general. Like we were talking about specialization being different individual to individual. It's real hard to get that. Now, where I thought you were going with that is with rising temperatures and flowers blooming at different time. How is that affecting, say, these specialists? And that has been investigated quite a bit. There seems to be a bit of energy going into that, and it's confusing. Some plants seem to be queuing in on the same thing that the bees are. And even though this plant might be blooming 2 weeks earlier, the bee is emerging 2 weeks earlier. And we see evidence of that. But then we also see evidence of this one blooming 2 weeks earlier, and then the bee emerging 2 weeks late. And so we're still trying to tease out what's the norm, like what really happens with that. But it's obviously a concern, as you know, conditions are getting warmer, and flowering, if it gets out of sync with when that bee is active, it might be really bad for the flower, and it's probably very bad for that bee if it is requiring a species of pollen that it's collecting. So sadly, I guess the main answer there is we don't know. But that is interesting about duration. So just, I guess, another side note with that. Typically, when you have a bee that is only active for 2 weeks or 3 weeks or a month, it's a specialist. And when you're active for more months, you're a generalist, because you have to be. Most flowers, and that kind of falls apart in tropical areas where you can get species blooming year round. But here, that is definitely the trend. And so those, with a specialist, you're looking at, is there overlap in time? Like, did they get out of sync? And that's kind of all over the place, those results. And then with your bees that are active for 2 months, did that get more or less? Because they're generalists, I think that there's, less interest in that. But also, they're probably foraging for about the same amount of time. But no clear answer there. So, yes.
In your opinion, do you think it's better to kind of have this narrative of only planting natives for bees, or do you think it's good still to just plant as many flowers as possible for the more generalist species to use?
So the question there is, do you just preference just native flowers or like just as many different flowers as possible? And I think the answer to that is it depends on the situation that you're dealing with. You're talking about landscaping, you've got like your house or a garden, and you're talking about flowering species that won't break loose and start invading an ecosystem. Yeah, go nuts. And it really seems that those ornamentals honeybees really like. And so it's good to have, you know, a good source because we need honeybees to do our agricultural practices and they need a good floral resource. And so all of that diversity can be good, but if you're looking at a restoration plot, yeah, keep that as native as you possibly can. And that's even going beyond bees. But you know, if you start getting an invasive species, just the way invasive species work, it's going to eventually crowd everything out, and you might have a lot of flower diversity when you plant them or spread the seeds or whatever it is. But 5 years, when that invasive takes over, you no longer have that diversity. So you've got to consider those components as well. Are there any other questions?
Nope.
All right. Thank you all very much.